Welcome back to Godless Reads, the Chilling Tales for Dark Night show where different godless authors read their own story. I'm Drew Stepek, owner of Godless.com and the Godless app. I'm also a horror author myself. At least I tell myself that. I'm also a used car salesman, a 90s dropout, and a dirty fucking old man who wants to win your love by throwing my hands around and being fucking a freak. On this episode, straight from Northern England, so far north, in fact, that it's fucking Scotland, we bring you D.E. McCLUSKEY. McCLUSKEY reads his story, The Breakup. We've all been there, man. Just not this gnarly. And this story is Gnarly with a capital G. Breakups totally fucking suck. But please don't do anything that D.E. McCLUSKEY's character, Chris, does in the story. Please? Great fucking disclaimer, right? If you haven't done so recently, go check out Godless.com or the Godless app. We're doing all sorts of freaking crazy giveaways. We're giving away Kindles, whole libraries from authors, etc. Do I even have to say it? You know what to do. Kick back, grab your drug of choice, and let D.E. McCLUSKEY tell you about his breakup.
The Breakup by D.E. McCLUSKEY. Part 1, Chapter 1. I'll be around in about an hour. I'll stop at the store and get a couple of bottles on the way. Chris was walking down the street with his mobile phone close to his ear. He was trying to keep the wind that was blowing from attacking the microphone with his other hand. I'll get a couple of bottles. We can watch that film on your streaming service. You know, the one with the guy that you're liking, he continued. He had to raise his collar on his jacket as the wind was so cold it was cutting through his layers, chilling him almost to the bone. On top of that, it had started to rain. He was wishing he'd used the car for this errand, but he was attempting to cut back from using it for shorter trips. He was telling everyone it was because he wanted to reduce his carbon footprint, but really it was because of the spiralling costs of petrol. "Can you hear me?" he shouted down the phone, battling almost another blast of wind. He tutted, looked at his phone and shook his head. He disconnected the call and selected the text function. "I'll be there in about an hour," he typed, the tips of his fingers raw in the cold early evening. He pressed send and continued his battle with the elements towards the shop. 2. "I got your favourite," he chirped as Joe opened the door. He held out the 2 bottles of Rioja, both with gold netting around them that he never quite understood. Either way, they were both their favourite brand and had cost them a good few pounds. So much so, he was glad he'd walked to Joe's now and not gotten a taxi. "Jesus Christ, you're soaked through," Joe said as she looked him up and down. "Get in and get that coat off." She turned, giving him space to enter her tidy little house. The front door led directly into the small but intimate living room, and the large kitchen, where they spent most of their time and not in the bedroom, was out to the back. "Wow, straight away you want me naked. Not even a 'hello, Chris,'" he laughed. She didn't, as she made her way into the living room and sat on the couch. He pouted a little as he stepped into the warmth, glad to be out of the freezing night. As he removed his soaking jacket, he spared the glance at her on the couch. She was wearing a heavy, baggy sweater, one he'd never seen before, and baggy sweatpants. Not something he would have thought conducive to a sexy night in front of the TV. He stripped off his dripping coat. "Can you hang that up by the back door?" she asked, still not looking at him. There was already an atmosphere. He could feel it between them. It was heavy, oppressive, like a blanket over you on a hot evening. If he hadn't been so cold and wet, he might have broken out into a sweat. He hung his coat by the back door, letting it drip on the tiled floor. Then, without another word to Joe, he walked upstairs and got himself a pair of pyjama bottoms from the cupboard where she kept his things. He peeled off his wet jeans, his socks and his boxer shorts, and dressed for an evening of lounging, drinking, laughing, and maybe, if he was lucky, a little something more. "Have you got the glasses?" he shouted down the stairs as he hung his wet clothes up on the banister to dry. "What?" she shouted back up at him. "I said, have you got the..." "Oh, never mind, I'll get them." He thumped down the stairs into the kitchen where the 2 bottles he had brought were on the counter, unopened and untouched. "Jesus, Joe, you could have opened one of them at least, to let it breathe." Her reply was an uninterested grunt. He looked into the living room and all he could see was the back of her head as she stared at the TV. He stood, looking at her for a moment, a calculation working its way through his head. He was trying to remember the last time she'd had her period. She was always grumpy around this time of the month. He remembered a bit of an argument, maybe 10 days ago, She'd started crying and said something about the time of month. He nodded as he fished around for a couple of glasses and then the drawer for a corkscrew. It couldn't have been that then. So, I still have a real chance of getting something tonight, he thought with a sly grin. He pulled the cork on the first bottle and carried it, along with the 2 glasses, into the living room. He put them on the table before her and sat back on the couch next to her. She shifted just slightly as he sat down, and he thought he felt her body go taut for a moment or two. Do you want me to pour? Again, without taking her eyes from the TV screen, she grunted her reply and nodded. He leaned forward and poured 2 large glasses of wine. He picked one up and offered it to her. She took it silently. He noted that she didn't sip from it straight away as normal, but kind of tucked it under her arm as she folded them. She might have been warming it up to room temperature as the bottles were still a little chilled, but something about her demeanour told him otherwise. She was definitely in a mood about something. What are we watching then? He asked, trying to break the ice in the cold atmosphere. Just a murder thing, she replied, finally taking a sip of her drink. You can turn it off if you want. I'm not that bothered. Nah, I love a good murder programme. You know that, he said, trying his best to sound cheery. 3. The programme was good, but he'd seen it before. He knew that Jo had too. However, she was glued to the screen, seemingly taking in every detail of the gruesome story. Several times Chris sighed. I'm sure we've seen this one before. Isn't it the one where it turns out to be the uncle who was over to stay after the breakup of his marriage? Chris, I'm trying to watch it, she said, still not looking at him. She took the last sip of her drink and he took the glass from her, filling it just over halfway. He did the same for himself. Is this it then? He asked, the wine sitting warm in his belly. Is this us, all night, just sitting here watching programmes we've already seen? Well, what else is there to do? She asked, her face reflecting the TV screen in the darkened room. Well, I thought there might be a little bit of conversation for one, he replied, the annoyance in his voice almost physical. She picked up the remote control and turned off the television. With a heavy sigh, she turned to face him, shifting her whole body towards him. She put the remote and her glass on the table and sighed again. You're right, Chris. Maybe we should talk. Part 2, Chapter 1. Get the fuck down on the floor right now. This is not a request. Face down on the floor, hands behind your head. If you're not willing to comply, you will be forcibly put down. Do you understand me? The voice came from everywhere, yet nowhere, all at the same time. It took him a sweet moment to realise it was aimed at him. There are 12 armed police with their weapons trained on you right now, the sharp voice continued. If you don't comply and get on the ground, they are authorised to open fire. Chris spun. There were bright lights everywhere. They were flashing bright blue and white. Even through the glare, he could see the sheer number of people on the street, and they were all looking at him. Instinctively, he raised his arms in the air. He'd seen the TV shows, hundreds of them. If someone shouted you like that, then putting your hands up was exactly what you did. As he raised them, an object fell from his grip. It clattered as it reached the ground. He looked at it, wondering exactly what it was, when an unexpected force from the side ran into him, bundling him over, and he hit the floor. As his head smacked on the concrete of Jo's path, he caught a glimpse inside the house he had just left. Jo wasn't there. Part 3, Chapter 1. Flashing lights, flashing images. His eyes were shut tightly. His body was racked with pain as blow after blow shook him. He had no idea what was happening. Images of blood flashed through the darkness. It was dark, thick and heavy, flying towards him as if someone had emptied a bucket of paint into the air. It splashed over him, soaking him, covering him. Something else flashed in the darkness, or rather glinted like metal reflecting light. Something like a memory pierced his brain, causing the same physical agony he'd experienced before leaving the house. It was a memory, but it couldn't be a memory because he didn't remember it happening. He was walking down a cold, wet street holding 2 bottles of red wine. There's another blow to his head and his arms are forced behind his back. He's shouting down the phone at someone. His voice is angry and he can feel the fury inside him swelling, spreading its vileness through him. Words like splitting up and don't come around and Alex are coursing through his brain. He could feel him being physically dragged along cold, wet ground, His hands were all over him, pulling, punching, bending his limbs to force him to comply to their barking orders. He's at Joe's door, banging on it, shouting. She's inside. He can hear her screaming at him to go away. He isn't going anywhere. He's here to have it out with her. The front door is forced open as he's kicked it, yelling for her to come out. He doesn't remember any of this. His world is full of shouting and screaming, people forcing him to sit up. Alex. How did he get into these memories? He hadn't been there. The tall, good-looking man is shouting at him, his face a mask of anger, his eyes ugly and bulging. There's a smashing sound. A bottle of wine has dropped to the floor. The other bottle is swinging through the air. It smashes into the angry face of his ex-friend. Alex has fallen backwards, holding his nose. There's blood, a lot of it. Another smash as the bottle that hit Alex explodes against the wall. All that's left is a jarred bottleneck. Red wine is spilling down his hands. The makeshift weapon thrusts forward, entering Alex's neck. Warm blood sprays from his friend, covering him. It's warm in his cold hands. There's steam too. It's rising from the hot blood in the cold evening. A scream pierces the memory. It's a female sound. It happens as Alex hits the floor while a pool of darkness begins to spread from below him. Chris is forced to his feet. His eyes are still closed and people are still shouting at him. He doesn't want to open them. He doesn't think he'll like what he sees when he does. A man is shouting something. He's attaching his hands together behind his back. It's cold and tight. Too tight. It's hurting him. He walks past Alex, stepping over the body as dark blood bubbles form on his lips. He drops the slippery bottleneck and it lands on the carpet next to the spreading blood. He knows the red wine will ruin the carpet, but he no longer cares. He can hear Joe screaming in the kitchen. It sounds like she's crying. She hadn't been crying on the phone with him half an hour ago. He sees her. Her back is against the counter on the far side of the small room. She's cornered and looks like she doesn't know what's happening or what to do about it. He knows what to do. The hand pushing his head is strong as he's forced into a vehicle. Rough hands are on his back, pushing him, coercing him. His eyes are still closed. People are shouting and he knows that that bright lights are everywhere. He doesn't want to see what's happening. Too much is already happening inside his head. He is opening the drawer where she keeps her knives, the ones he bought her as a move-in present before they were even together. His red-stained hand reaches in and removes his favourite tool, the chef's knife. The red from the wine and from Alex's blood is smearing the handle, and he knows he's going to have to wash this utensil before it's used again. Jo is sobbing, begging for him to put the knife down. Her face is wet from tears streaming down her cheeks. She's wearing a baggy sweater and baggy sweatpants. The sweater is beige. He's never seen it before. Beige suits her. "Open your fucking eyes!" The order was from someone so close to him he could feel spittle hit his face and smell the coffee on its breath. Whoever it was, they sounded angry. Chris thought that he should comply with the order, but first he needed to know what happened. The knife enters the folds of the beige sweater easily, probably because she never used these knives. It was always him that cooked, and he was always careful to use them correctly. There's nothing worse than trying to use a blunt knife. It slides into her chest with little resistance. Her screaming stops. Her face looks shocked. Her brows furrowed. He pushes the knife further into her and she begins to deflate. It's an odd sensation watching another person shrink, but that's exactly what was happening right before his eyes. He pulls the knife from her chest and sticks it in again. He reaches and holds her as she begins to slide down the kitchen counter. That's when the blood comes. It's thick and warm, just like Alex's. "Why?" she asks. It doesn't sound like her voice. It's breathier, as if she has a cold or a sore throat. He doesn't answer. He just pulls the knife out and pushes it back in again. He does this again and again and again, each time holding her up so she doesn't fall onto the blood-soaked tiles of the kitchen floor. Finally, he lets her go. She then falls. Her head crashes and splashes into the puddle of blood formed on the hard tiles. He pulls her across the floor, marveling at how heavy she is, into the living room. A noise in the street distracts him. He ignores it. He's far too concerned about what's happening in here to worry about what's happening out there. Propping her up against the couch, he continues to stab her, this time in a frenzy. He knows he's not going to be able to move tomorrow due to all this exercise, yet he continues to slash and cut. More noises come from outside. They grab his attention, but he continues to ignore them. The neighbourhood has always been a bit rough, and these last few months it had just gotten worse. "Open your fucking eyes, or I swear I'll cut them out." The close male voice swore at him. He didn't want to open them, he just needed to know what had happened. All he could remember about the evening was a nice but sad conversation on the couch before he left. Before all of this, he continues to cut her, to stab her, to ruin her. The old cliché playing through his head over and over and over. If I can't have her, no one can. Sweat stung his eyes and all the strength from his arm was gone. As he pulled the knife from his stomach for the last time, there was a gargling noise. It was coming from her wounds, but also from her mouth, as pink bubbles formed, filled with her last breaths. He wanted them. He wanted to taste her dying air badly. He leans in and licks them from the corner of her mouth. They are sour, more so than he would have thought, but they were hers, so he swallowed them. Savouring the flavour of her death, he plunges the knife into her one last time, this time into her neck. He cuts. It takes all the strength he has left in him to do it, but he almost manages to sever her head. He wipes blood-laced sweat from his face as her head falls from her shoulders. It hangs by just a few tendrils of sinew and flesh. He sighs and forces his numb arms back up to cut them. Her head tumbles to the carpet. He chuckles as he thinks there's no going back for this carpet now. It's completely ruined. No amount of spray will ever get these stains out. He looks towards the open door beyond Alex's body. There's a commotion happening in the street with flashing lights and people shouting. He needs to know what was going on, and now that his work in here is done, maybe it's the time to do so. 2. Get the fuck down on the floor right now. This is not a request. Face down on the floor, hands behind your head. If you're not willing to comply, you'll be forcibly put down. Do you understand me? He turns, looking at the bright lights in the dark night. There are 12 armed police with their weapons trained on you right now, the sharp voice continued. If you don't comply and get on the fucking ground, they are authorized to open fire. He raises his hands like he'd seen in the movies and on those murder programs Joe loves so much. Something falls from his hand. It clatters onto the floor and he looks at it. He doesn't quite recognize what it is as something hits him from the side and he is bundled to the floor, hard. 4. What? Chris spat as he looked at it. You wanna what? Oh, Chris, please don't make this harder than it already is, Joe pleaded with him. Her long dark hair was pulled back into a ponytail, giving her beautiful face a hardened look. She shrugged as she tried to smile. I just think we should split up. Where the fuck has this come from? He asked, putting his glass down on the table. He slammed it a little too hard, spilling the wine on the carpet below. Shit! He stood up and looked at the stain. I'll go and get something to clean it up. Leave it, she said, grabbing his arm, stopping him from walking away. He pulled away from her grasp. It'll stain. I don't mind. Listen, we need to talk. I'm sorry, but I need out of this relationship. You're stifling me. Chris's brow furrowed and his eyes squinted. I'm stifling you. What exactly does that mean? She turned away, back towards the dark TV in the dark room. Exactly what it sounds like. I think this is a me problem. Oh, don't you fucking dare, he spoke, his voice low, but the anger in it surprising him. Don't you even dare say that this is more to do with you than it is me. I know where this is coming from. You do? She asked, looking back at him. A noise in the street distracted him for the moment, but what was happening in here was more important than what was happening out there. I do. It's about Alex, isn't it? Joe's silence spoke volumes. Chris's shoulders slumped. So it is about Alex? She didn't reply, just swallowed. He heard the audible click as her obviously dry throat attempted to lubricate itself. He looked down at the wine stain on the carpet. He looked at the ridiculous pajamas he had on, Oversized sweaty bottoms and oversized top. At some point he must have spilled the wine over himself as there was a spread of rioja down his front. He sighed and sat back down on the couch next to his now ex-girlfriend. There was a moment of silence. It was longer than a moment. It felt like an eternity where he was lost in thought. Good times. He couldn't really remember any bad times. He chuffed through his nose. "What are you laughing about?" she asked, a ghost of a smile on her face. "I'm just remembering our first date." She grinned as she turned from him, once again focusing on the blank TV screen. He wished she hadn't turned it off now. I was so nervous, she laughed. Or was it a sigh? He couldn't tell. "I went to the toilet to redo my makeup, and when it came out again, you were gone." Chris did laugh this time as he nodded. "I remember. You were in there so long. I thought you'd fucked off out the window or something, trying to get away from me." She laughed again. "I walked out and it felt like everyone in the pub was staring at me, laughing because you'd done a runner. I just sat there at the table and finished my drink. And that's when I came back in. I was so relieved that you were there." "Not more than I was, because we hadn't paid for the drinks yet and I don't think I had enough money." "Do you remember the dogging incident?" "Oh, fuck yeah," Joe replied. She was laughing now, and the sincerity in it broke his heart. "We parked up at the point and turned the engine off." "Yeah, and we were getting it on when you flashed the fucking lights with your ass, didn't you?" She snorted with laughter. It wasn't a pretty sound, but it was one he loved. "Then all those weirdos surrounded the car, all wearing their Macs and stuff." Chris was laughing himself again. "What did you call them? The wanking dead?" "The wanking dead, I remember. I'm sure that one fella was so close to getting off." They both stopped laughing at the same time. Another noise from outside caught his attention. It was louder than the last, but still, he put it back of his mind and concentrated on what was happening. "We had some great times, didn't we, Joe?" he said, taking a deep breath. "Didn't we?" he thought. Past tense. He knew in his heart they were over. He couldn't compete with Alex. They'd been friends for years. Plus, as guys go, Alex had it all. The thing was, Chris couldn't hate him, and he couldn't bring himself to hate Joe either. The silence was back between them. It was thick, like fog, or maybe smog would be a better word for it. Dirty, thick, black smog. The noise from outside came again. Once again it was louder. It sounded like cars screeching up and down the road. This neighbourhood had always been rough, and over the last few years it had gotten even worse. Well, maybe I should go," he mumbled, breaking the ugly reticence between them. "No, stay and drink that second bottle." He knew she was just being polite. She looked as eager for him to leave as he was to go. "No, I'll get off. Listen, about you and Alex." Her smile was sad and it almost broke his heart again. He shrugged. "Listen, no hard feelings, okay? At least we can try to stay friends. It does happen sometimes." Joe got up off the couch. Now he understood her choice of clothing. Big baggy jumper and saggy running bottoms. She'd wanted to make herself as unattractive as she could. "I bet Alex never sees her in that," he thought. The thought was cynical and he chastised himself for it. Although part of him thought he deserved the slight, he'd earned it tonight. She surprised him by wrapping her arms around him and hugging him tight. "You're something special. You know that, Chris. Someone will be lucky to get you." Just not you, eh? He hated himself for saying it the instant it slipped from his lips. It killed the hug. She stepped back from him, the same sad smile back on her face. The wine from his pyjama top had rubbed off onto her sweater, and he was glad. He knew it was petty, but he was glad. He did love Joe. He'd harboured fantasies of asking her to marry him when his promotion in work came. They were going to have kids, a nice house, a nice car, a fucking dog. "You fucking bitch," she screamed in his head. "How the fucking hell could you do this to me? How?" "I'll get me coat and stuff, then I'll get off. I'll get someone to come round for me stuff over the next couple of days. Listen, there's no rush, honestly." He closed his eyes and nodded. "Right then," he said, stretching, a fake smile blooming on his face. "This wasn't how I expected our night to go." She replied with another sad smile. Without another word, he took himself upstairs to retrieve his wet jeans, t-shirt and underpants. When he was back, she had his coat in her hands, waiting to help him into it. He gripped the door handle. Agony shot through him. It started in his chest before travelling all the way up to his brain. He froze. It was like an ice cream headache, brain freeze, and it passed in a moment. "See you, Joe," he whispered as his head cleared. Tears stung his eyes, but he didn't want her to see them. "See you, Chris," she whispered back. He turned the door handle and stepped out into the dark, cold, wet night.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.